Greetings, Taku Faithful. Thank you for joining me again this week. Once again, it's Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief, and I'm here to bring you all yet again another Game of Thrones episode review right here on Otaku Assemble Weekly. And as always, I'm here to bring you the latest in this week's Game of Thrones episode review. And this is my review of Season 3, Episode 7, entitled The Bear and the Maiden Fair. Now, my general thoughts on this week's episode, I'm actually feeling a bit indifferent about this week's episode, and that's because there were several things that I thought worked well in the episode and a couple of things that I thought didn't, and I'll address those in more detail throughout this review. So the first thing I want to talk about in regards to this week's episode is the romantic relationships. I was actually a bit surprised that they dedicated so much time in this week's episode to the relationships. In fact, I believe the first 15 minutes was almost exclusively focusing on the romantic relationships. Now, normally, when a television series will dedicate an entire episode to the romantic relationships, normally I'm hesitant towards that. Both because my personal taste is that I like my romantic relationships to be developed slowly over time, over the course of a season or over the course of multiple seasons. I like taking the time to do it right. And so whenever a series will just center the entire episode on the relationship, a lot of times I'm kind of discouraged by that. And that's also because I've seen it done poorly so many times before in the past. Now, that's not necessarily what this episode did, but it did spend a fair amount of time on it. And in hindsight, thinking about it now, I'm starting to think that maybe the focus on the romantic relationships in this episode had less to do with actually actually pushing the plot forward, had less to do with that and more to do with just slowing down the pace. Think about it like this. The past 2 weeks with episodes 5 and 6, we were given so much material. We were getting bits of so many different stories that those episodes actually went by fairly quickly because of all the material and because of all the ground they had to cover. So now, right before the climax of the season, this would be the point where you would kind of start slowing things down a bit. The calm before the storm, if you will. So ideally what I'm talking about is episode 7 would slow down the pace. Episode 8 would start building up momentum again for episode 9, which is normally the climax with the Game of Thrones season. So what I'm saying is the focus on the relationships in this week's episode makes sense. Less of form and more function. But that's not to say that all of them were bad. Some of them were actually pretty good, and some of them were actually my favorite parts of the episode. For an example, what I thought worked really well, Jon and Ygritte's scenes. Those, I think, worked exceptionally well, and not just because, well, first off, that's the one scene where I felt like they weren't pandering. Because let's face it, the nudity and the sexual material in this episode screamed pandering. Screamed eye candy, screamed hardcore pandering in this week's episode. It was glaringly obvious, and so Jon and Ygritte's scene didn't have that, right? So we didn't have to worry about that. What we were getting was actual character development. What we were getting was legitimate context. We were getting good material between them. Their conversations with, now that they're on the other side of the wall, Jon, see the role reversal. I like how they're doing this. Jon has kind of taken Ygritte's place from last season, where now he's informing her about his world on the other side of the wall. But at the same time, you have this somewhat unspoken tension between the two of them that I felt has actually been instigated and actually been initiated by Orell and his comments to Jon, his conversation with Ygritte. And now that those separate conversations and the comments that he makes about their relationship is going on in each of their heads individually, it is creating this somewhat unspoken tension going on. So when you add that, and then I just like how they keep developing Ygritte's character, and this was the first episode that I actually realized how significant of a character she really was. In many ways, she is almost like the physical manifestation of Jon's struggle north of the Wall. From the time when they both met to the time when he killed Corn Halfhand, infiltrated Mance Raider's camp, and then has been a double agent with the Wildlings. All of the eternal struggle, you know, and even how his outlook on life and some of his preconceived notions and some of his beliefs, how they have been questioned throughout this entire journey. Ygritte is almost the physical representation of that. How her relationship with him mirrors his struggle in the story so far. And I'm just starting to kind of piece this together and start seeing that comparison, that parallel that's been set up. So that relationship and its work in this episode, I thought worked really well. Now, one relationship that not one relationship, but one scene that I'm actually in the middle with is Rob's scene, because on the one hand we got some important information, like Rob's an expecting dad now, and then we also got to see another scene with him and his wife more intimately, because in this season especially there haven't been many of those. Most of their scenes have been group scenes or have been scenes with other company. We haven't got enough of them together intimately alone by themselves. We haven't gotten too many scenes this season. So those were the two good things that came about it. But of course, like I said, one of the bad things is, of course, the nudity pandering, and another was that a good portion of that dialogue felt like filler. I can't help but think that scene could have been a lot shorter than it actually was. So when you take those things into consideration, that's why I say I'm kind of on the middle ground about that scene. And then the romantic relationship scene that did not work for me whatsoever in this episode was Tyrion's conversation with Shae. And that's because it was a useless scene. We knew what Shae's reaction to the arranged marriages would be. That was foreshadowed with that bullshit scene with Shae accusing Tyrion of having a thing for Sansa earlier in the season, which makes me think. I'm starting to think that more so now that scene was filler. That scene, the one that I'm talking about with Tyrion and Shae, you all will remember from my review a couple of weeks ago when I talked about, how could Shae accuse Tyrion of wanting Sansa? Like that's not predicated on anything that's ever been set up in this. You all remember it. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch the review. Now I'm starting to think that scene was more filler now than ever, because here's the thing. That scene foreshadows the arranged marriage, right, between Tyrion and Sansa. But I'm pretty damn sure that fucking Martin wouldn't have written his book like that, because he would have wanted the arranged marriage to come across as somewhat of a surprise. So if that's the case, if I'm right on that, then that means that the fucking showrunners made a scene to foreshadow an event that should have been a surprise like it was in the book. But by doing that, then that conversation in this week's episode is even more fucking useless, because we already got that information. Do you follow what I'm saying? We didn't need the Shae Tyrion scene in this episode because we already got it. under well, shit, not even under a different context. It was pretty much the same damn conversation. And that's what I could have fucking done without in this episode. Other than that, though, there were a lot of other things I thought were pretty interesting. Gendry's scene with Melisandre. I thought that was pretty interesting. Arya abandoning the Brotherhood and being abducted by the Hound. See, I'm really indifferent about that scene because on the one hand, I'm thinking, okay, took her long enough because I've been saying it for the past 2 weeks, like, Arya's not going to stay with the Brotherhood. I want her to, but I know she isn't. Their interest is not hers. So she's going to end up leaving them, whether it's being dropped off or her running away or whatever. So when the scene happened, I was like, okay, saw that happening. But then being abducted by the Hound, I'm like, why is this come across? Why am I getting the sense that this is coming across as plot convenience? Like, the Hound left the Brotherhood episodes ago, and you're telling me he's still lingering around in the woods, and he just so happened to conveniently scoop up Arya when she leaves the Brotherhood? That's too coincidental. Unless he was planning on that or something like all I'm saying is that wasn't an accident. And so yeah, that's why I just feel indifferent about that scene. Dany's scene I thought was actually pretty interesting. Also, her course of action, her way of conquest, I thought was pretty interesting. The fact that Dany, now that she has her army, she's actually conquering these other cities. Now, Astapor, I figured, yeah, she was going to conquer that city because, of course, you know, the slave trader was a two-timer, and this, that, and the other, and of course, she didn't really have the muscle, so, you know, she kind of had to outwit him and whatnot. But now with this new city, like, she's just barging in there, calling the shots, and I found that kind of surprising because I'm like, wow. You know, now that she actually has some collateral of her own, you think she would be willing to kind of broker off a deal and maybe making a partner, an ally, you know, someone who could help her in her conquest instead of just barging in there and taking the whole damn thing over. But and actually, you know what? I would have preferred that because Dany's course of action towards this new city is starting to really push this notion that the only people who make alliances in this show are those who are desperate, because those who aren't have no need to make friends. That's been an idea that's been kind of floating around while I've been watching the show, but Dany's scenes in this week's episode is really starting to make that apparent now. Because you'll notice, those who are in a position of power don't broker deals. They don't have to. Which is pretty fucking cynical. But anyway. And let me see, is there any other scene I wanted to talk about? Oh, well, since I'm gonna, okay, I guess I can mention a couple of more negatives that I thought about the episode. Sansa's scene. Thought it was useless. Thought it was pointless. I mean, it's pretty much Sansa's reaction to finding out the news about the arrangement, but they play it off as this, like, girl talk with Marjorie, and then they get into a sex discussion. Really? Like, and now listen, I'm being fair. I'm being fair. Half of that discussion actually was important. Talking about, you know, what could this mean, her marrying Tyrion? That was important. But the sex talk wasn't. And the fact that that's what came at the tail end of the conversation, I felt like was trying to, well, okay. Consider this. Could the sex talk have been Marjorie trying to conceal her ulterior motives for having the discussion with Sansa in the first place? You know, distracting her with the idea of sleeping with Tyrion so that she is no longer considering all of the bigger issues with the arranged marriage. That's a possibility, but I think that would be giving. Nah, I think that's just being way too fucking optimistic. Yeah, I think that's just reading way too into that fucking scene. So yeah, that scene I could have done without. Didn't really need it. And in all honesty, I actually would have preferred to have that scene with somebody other than if you have to portray that scene with Sansa, I would have much rather preferred it with somebody else. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Marjorie. She's still one of my favorite characters in the show, but I think it would have been much more fucking interesting if she would have had that scene with, well, shit, why didn't they give her that scene with Shae and not the Shae and fucking Tyrion scene? Or God forbid, why not have a fucking scene with her and Varys? You know, that's a fucking combination of characters we don't see on screen very often. Perfectly good opportunity to. Anyway, and I think I'm gonna close up this review with I think it's gonna be my final comments about. Well, no, actually no. I do want to mention Jaime's scene. So, but I'm gonna go ahead and mention Theon's scene right here. And this will probably be the last time I mention Theon. I'm hoping it won't be, but from the looks of things, this is going to be the last time I mention Theon this season. So I'm letting you all know now. If Theon's story doesn't amount to shit by the end of this season, I'm not discussing him in any more of these reviews for this season until something exciting or something or fuck exciting until something actually happens, until something that progresses the fucking plot actually occurs in Theon's story. I'm not bringing him up again. That's it. I'm fucking done. This is by far the biggest waste of time in this season. Theon's whole little story arc had one good episode. One. The rest of it is just bullshit, and I don't need it. I don't know why it's in the series. Fucking Theon is not even that popular of a character. Because this isn't the same thing like Jon and Dany scenes last season being stretched out to no end so that those characters can fucking appear in damn near every episode. Theon isn't even that popular of a fucking character. Or at least in my eyes, he isn't. So his whole story up to this point in this season, useless. I have absolutely no need for it whatsoever. And until something happens, something of relative significance, I'm not mentioning him anymore. Done. And my final comments are going to be on Jaime's scenes. I thought those were really well done. And I think that what they've done with him and Brienne in this episode was the best character relationship that's not that's not a couple, that's not a romantic couple, but when you're just talking about like how the regular characters interact with one another, Jaime and Brienne's, that was the best in this episode, right behind Jon and Ygritte. So they did a pretty good job with that. And yeah, and I'll give Jaime credit, you know, saving Brienne and then walking out of there like a G while the fucking Reigns of Castamere instrumental was playing. Yeah, that was pretty cool. I'll give him credit for that. Okay, yeah, you had a pimp status moment. Congratulations, Mr. fucking Lannister. I'm not completely sold on fucking Jaime's whole character arc yet. I mean, it's still a well-written and well-developed arc. Don't get me wrong. But if you're talking about Jaime as being a redemptive type character. Still not sold on it, but he did win points in this week's episode, so I'll give him credit for that. But anyway, with that being said, that's gonna wrap up this week's Game of Thrones episode review. I want to thank you all for joining me again this week. And this has been Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief. I'm signing off, reminding the Otaku Faithful, if you guys have not placed your votes for the summer 2013 uploading schedule, make sure you check out my update video that was posted last night. Make sure you check out the video so you can get the full update, and make sure you comment or respond in the comments of that video. Yeah, make sure you get that in, because those votes will be closing very soon. So don't waste time. Make sure you get those votes in. And with that being said, this has been Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief, signing off. And until next time, peace.